and I keep saying that this podcast is going to be weekly, and I keep missing weeks, and I've got to stop being hard on myself about it all. But I feel like I'm starting to set up training model the way that I've always wanted it to be, and I've been taking a lot of action in the programs, the courses, the mentorships, the whole thing, and it's just been quite overwhelming. Some of the stuff that's been on my plate, but I'm starting to clear it off slowly but surely, and we're making progress, which is awesome. So I appreciate you sticking by. Yeah. So obviously, I have just launched a free course on the Training Model website. It will be the first link down below. It's completely free. Currently, there are 7 20-minute videos linked in the free course. And I've set the course up in a way because sometimes I go on rants on social media, especially, and I kind of hope that people have the context of the ideas that I'm discussing. Obviously, if you come through either the wormhole or the movement mentorship or even the programs, the squat and deadlift or the bench press and reach program, you'll start to get some of the context of the idea. Obviously, the mentorship and the wormhole, we should have all of it, but the programs, potentially some of the context of the ideas that I like to discuss. But yeah, because of that, I decided just to make a free course that kind of gets everybody to the level that I think is necessary to have the conversations that I like having, and some of the, I like to think about them as zoomed out ideas, because I do believe if you zoom too far into something, you miss a lot of the context of what actually matters for programming and helping clients and coaching. So ultimately, that's what this course is for, is just to get everybody on the context needed to have really good detailed conversations around helping clients and coaching. So today's podcast is really just going to be running through those 7 videos. There will be more videos eventually. The next part of the free course will be 2 business related ideas, one with marketing and one with profit or finance management. But ultimately, I do plan on adding more to the free course just over time as little things pop up to help people better understand some of the ideas that I discussed. So yeah, today we're just going to chat about those 7 videos and kind of unpack some of the key things that's within them. So the first one is load and what is load. I believe I did a podcast on that already to discuss it in detail, but ultimately what we're trying to better understand is what actually moves the needle forward for adaptations with clients and the process. Obviously, science is and the people in the scientific community, they're trying to find, the way that I like to view it is they're trying to find the answers to like the mechanistic truths of why things happen and what drives adaptation and physiology and biology and hormonal based things and all of those sort of things that influence obviously the productivity of training and getting a better truth or a better understanding of exactly what is causing outcomes or changing outcomes, which is fantastic. However, what I do believe is that coaches, especially younger coaches who don't have a lot of coaching experience, it's very easy to fall into the trap where you think that all of this like scientific backed optimization of training becomes the stuff that is needed to be worried about first and foremost when making decisions around helping clients for strength, hypertrophy, mobility, whatever it is. It doesn't really matter. Cardiovascular adaptations or all of them, speed, fatigue, power, whatever it might be. A lot of the times these scientific discussions, they kind of leave you believing, and this is what the video covers, is that the external load or the way in which we program, the way in which we actually like deliver our understanding of training is more important than the actual process of training itself, which is the truth. And that is that there is an individual based sort of response to training and the external load of a program that matters more. That internal response matters significantly more. And that's what we're unpacking within that very first video on the free course. It is simply just discussing what load is. And when we discuss load as a coach and as people that are trying to help others make adaptations and progress their objective training outcomes, we need to understand internal load. And internal load is the internal response to the external load. And that internal loading, I had a question come through the course. A key thing with the internal loading is that it has to be immediate. You have to understand immediately how the system is responding to the training. Any like retrospective internal or subjective review processes for training management is fantastic. However, when we actually think about the internal loading and the response of the actual session or the set or the exposure that we're undertaking, the immediate awareness of what is happening at an individual level is what is most important to understand. And this is why I really love RPE based training. I'm very bullish on RPE. I have been for nearly a decade now, but it just makes the most sense that there should be some kind of subjective performance metric that goes along with the external loading metrics of sets, reps, loads, tempos, range of motion, and all that sort of stuff, because the subjective stuff is actually what matters for the progression of training. Not just subjective as an isolated, but it's the combination of both. And I think that's why RPE just makes the most sense from a programming standpoint. Obviously, there will be times where RPE is not the right fit for a client, and there's many cases for that. A lot of people get confused thinking that RPE is somehow a like advanced programming strategy, where in reality it's just not. If anything, RPE is like a personality based strategy for load selection. And when I say that, what I'm saying is certain personalities don't do well with RPE. They don't. And then we get into the discussion of like top down and bottoms up sort of frameworks around decision making and prescriptions and all of that. But some people need top down constraints for them to be actually motivated to train and push themselves. It's got nothing to do with their subjective awareness of how difficult the session is. It's just that they are more motivated to train harder when they have top down constraints, when they actually have some rules and restrictions of what they can and can't do. If you give the wrong person too much freedom in their approach, they may lose motivation, lose interest, feel like they're not doing the right things, and all of a sudden their training sort of expression is reduced. So it's not so much that RPE is a beginner or advanced based strategy. It's really just that it works really, really well for most people. And there's always going to be a select number of people that it doesn't work well in the same way as every prescription strategy does. And if you have a good model to understand that, I think the top-down, bottoms-up model makes the most sense. You can see where and when that wouldn't fit within their prescriptions. But ultimately, I think you should have some sort of subjective, acute data that you're tracking in some way. RPE makes the most sense. I also really like just like subjective training week recaps, how training's going, what's working well, what's not working well, what did you think you did well, what was your biggest win for the week, all of those sort of things to just highlight and get a better understanding of exactly how the training is being sort of managed. So plenty of really good things in that initial video, but ultimately what we're trying to get a better grasp of is what is internal load and that internal response to the training program, and then also how can we better manage that and progress that understanding by understanding the health implications or the health lifestyle strategies, psychological influences and training history and all of those sort of things, how they all influence, how this subjective soup of the individual all influences the productivity of training, regardless of how optimized your program is, because to a degree, the training program itself actually doesn't matter. You could write the perfect program in the world, but if the client doesn't do it, if they're not interested and they're not motivated, their goals change and all of those sort of things, or they simply just aren't putting in the effort required to see progress, they won't. Because a lot of it stems from that internal response. So that is what the first video is, which is load. The second one is model. When you understand what models are, you know how models are created. And the way in which a model is created is an understanding that there is assumed knowledge everywhere. Everywhere within science, and that's why the scientific process is the way it is. It's not trying to find the answer, it's trying to ask better questions of why things might be happening. And then as we get better understanding and information, we can start to ask even better questions again. And it refines the process over time so that we can have a more accurate understanding of what's going on. And ultimately, this is what models are and why they're created, is because there is assumed knowledge that every decision is based on. And if you are trying to get the most accurate, optimized progression of anything, what you'll realize is that it doesn't exist, and it will never exist because we never have all of the information required to make the most optimized decision. Ultimately, like looking at any model and saying, oh, that's wrong because of this and that's wrong because of this, because you've got a different understanding or a different vantage or a different model that you're coming from. No shit, they're all wrong. Everything's wrong. The whole thing's wrong. We're just trying to ask better questions and move in a direction with positive outcomes without having all of the information. And I think that's just really important to understand for young coaches, because models are everywhere. And once you start to understand the governing principles that underpin majority of these models, you'll start to see that a lot of them have more in common than people will ever let you believe. And if you wanted to go into some models related to human movement, I would highly recommend looking into tensegrity-based models. Because tensegrity-based models, and I prefer tensegrity-based models when I'm discussing human movement, because I think they are a little bit more zoomed out. They are a little bit more all-encompassing. They do a really good job of not blaming and narratizing certain muscles or certain positions as good or bad, or the reason that your hip hurts is because of X, or that your ankle doesn't do this because of Y. Instead of blaming all of these ideas, they're a little bit more zoomed out with an understanding of how the system is just managing forces, both external and internal, to achieve tasks. And I think tensegrity-based models make the most sense, and that's part of my sort of tag around bone first movement models being a little bit more productive, I think, for learning, rather than going straight to the muscles and the contraction process of the muscles. I think you're better off taking a step back and understanding the motion that's available of the human body first, and then how that motion is both created and responded to via muscular tension. And that's my whole model in and of itself is a tensegrity-based model, which is that gravity is influencing the system first and foremost, and everything is a reaction to the gravity influence on the structure and the joints and the muscles and all of those sort of things. And what we observe is laid on top of the gravity management strategy of the human. And there are some assumptions within that. And one of the big assumptions and biases within my model and what I teach around is that most people they're going to favor moving forward in space than any other direction. And I have narratives around that, and the system wants to move forward, and we use gravity to leverage and passively load certain structures within the body, and it all comes back from a gait cycle understanding. But ultimately, one of the biases and narratives that I use, because we have to have assumed knowledge in some way, otherwise we just sit there taking data, waiting for the right answer to come forward, which is just never going to be. One of the assumptions is that the system is more than likely going to extend when it produces high amounts of force. And when I think of strength training in the world that I live in, that is what the outcome is. The production of what we're trying to create. The objective outcome is higher force production. And we do that via increasing muscle mass and tolerating more volume as a response to that, but also being able to actually use our brain to produce as much force down into the ground or another object as possible. And in that process, more often than not, the system will try to extend and move forward in space to do so. And then this is where we have pressure changes in the feet. This is where we have a lumbar spine and a pelvis that moves forward and closes off hip space. And all of these sort of things is based off the assumption that when people are trying to get strong, when people are trying to produce more force, the system will likely want to extend in order to do so. And it's just like this built-in thing that lives within every human. And it all stems from pushing down into the ground in order to erect ourselves and stand up in a bipedal way. But ultimately, it's a model. There's things that are right. There's plenty of truths in it, but there's also some assumed knowledge that just has to be there so we can make productive decisions. Because anyone that's looking for the right answer all the time is walking down a dark path with not much hope on the other side. We just don't have all of the answers, but that is okay, because models help us understand and cross the abyss of knowledge. So if you're keen to learn more about models and model thinking and some of the key ones, I go through the BPS model very quickly. I go through tensegrity based models versus biomechanical based models, which is your typical textbook anatomy. And I also go through the constraint based model from Newell, which is related to movement expression and like inputs into the system that influence the processing and actually creates the expression. I'd recommend checking out that video too. Number 3 is tension. And what I believe to be the biggest mishap for muscle-based or muscle-first movement models, which is that everything is founded on the idea that a muscle contracts, which is true. A muscle definitely contracts, but it's only part of the process that a muscle creates. And if we look from a tensegrity-based model of movement, what we're actually observing when we think about muscular tension is a tensile force strategy or management strategy within the system. So if we look at physics and types of forces that can impact an object or a being or whatever it is in the physical world, there's a whole bunch of different forces that can apply. The most important ones for us as coaches to understand are what is called contact forces and non-contact forces. Gravity is an example of a non-contact force. We're not in interaction with gravity. It's affecting us, but we're not feeling it. All that's happening is we are getting pulled down to the ground, and it's happening all the time. That compressive force, that non-contact compressive force, as it pushes us down or pulls us down, depending on which model you want to learn to use. Newtonian physics versus Einstein-based physics, but gravity, the easiest way to think about it is pulling us towards the earth. That is creating a compressive force in the system, and that compressive force is best managed via the bones. The bone structure manages compressive force significantly better. It's why they're structured the way they are. It's how they deal with prolonged compressive forces and the differences of like lower body bones compared to upper body bones. And dealing with those compressive forces is best dealt with the bone structure, the skeletal structure. The other type of force that we need to understand then is what is called a tensile force. And a tensile force is a stretching force. Compressive is a squeezing force. Tensile force is a stretch-based force. And if we think about the human skeleton and the human system that's getting squashed down towards the ground with this compressive force, there has to be something else that manages that process productively. And that is where we get to the soft tissues of the human structure. And we get to the muscular system that creates and manages tension. We get to the tendons that manage and create tension differently to the muscles, but they manage tension. They create and manage tension. Then we get to ligaments that manage tension when a joint moves to end range of motion and it starts to open up on one side. If it passes the capacity of the bone, of the muscles and the tendon, the ligament is there to support and stretch and manage that tensile force or that moving force through a tensile reaction. Ligament is a tensile management strategy. Same with fascia. Fascia lives within this as well. Soft tissues of the structure best manage and deal with these stretch forces that come into the system as we react to the gravity compressive force and move through space, lifting weights, doing whatever it might be, running and jumping and all of this sort of stuff. The compressive force is best dealt with the bones, and the tensile forces are best dealt via the soft tissue structures and the muscles and the tendons and the ligaments and the fascia. And that is why I like to think about it as a tensegrity-based model, because it makes significantly more sense than any other based model. When you actually zoom out far enough, you'll start to see exactly what it is. And the whole system is dealing with the forces. It's not an isolated, localized joint or muscle or any of that sort of stuff. The entire system is dealing with those forces. So why would we blame something? And when we go through a muscle first lens, we end up blaming stuff. This is where you get to the idea of joint stability is trainable, in that the joint position in space is somehow this tug of war between the opposing muscles and the strength and the timing that those muscles have. Glute med versus adductor when your knees are coming in. The adductors are too strong. Your glute med's not strong enough. We need to strengthen the glute med. No, We don't need to do anything in isolation. If you want to get better at squatting, you need to spend more time squatting and get better at the skill of squatting, and potentially change your setup or your execution so you can express the movement how you deem to be the best expression of squatting. This is where we get to the golden archetypes of different techniques and the big rocks and all those sort of things. Never blame a single muscle, never blame an isolated part of the joint. It's always an understanding of the entire system's coordinated ability to both absorb and deal with forces through the entire chain. And that's why I like tensegrity-based models from the second video. And then that's how we like to think about it when we think of the muscles and what they actually do. Because a muscle doesn't simply contract. The muscle manages tensile forces. It responds to the compressive force of gravity and the task, and it creates tension to move and coordinate the bones. And that tensile force that it creates can be contraction, but it can also be passive tension. It could also be active and passive are the two groups. So it could be active or it could be passive. Active meaning there's byproducts because it's metabolic. Passive meaning that it's not metabolic. There's like neurophysiological qualities within the structure of those tissues that provide a tension response related to the task at hand and the speed and the velocity and the length of the muscles. I made a post about this today as well if you wanted to check that out. But tension is really important to understand, especially if you want to have an actual productive conversation around why things might be moving and how things could be improved. Next is stability, which we've kind of just unpacked a little bit, but stability, like what is it and what it isn't. And ultimately, like with this understanding of tensegrity-based models and then this understanding that tension is a reactive response to what is happening and the forces that are being being exposed to and dealt with by the system. So both forces absorbed, and they could be external forces like gravity or like loads or movements and all of those sort of things, momentum as well. It's a reaction of all of those external forces and a reaction to the task. And ultimately it's a systemic reaction that is creating the muscular force. No matter how you view it, it is always a reactive process. The muscular system is one of the final port of call in managing these processes. And stability, when we look at it in this lens, it doesn't make any sense why stability then would be this isolated idea around a certain muscle's strength or a certain muscle's coordination or a certain muscle's sort of impact and influence on a joint's position in space, because it's just not true. It's always a systemic expression that we're observing, and we label it as good or bad, but it's really not good or bad. It's just that it might not be the best strategy for what we deem the task is and the efficiency of what the task requires. So stability is something that I'm going to continue to just harp on, because I think the idea of stability is coming from the wrong side of learning human movement. It's coming from that muscle-centered understanding and that contraction-centered understanding, and that if a muscle is, or if a motion is happening that goes against all of the preconceived understanding of efficiency, that it's a muscle's fault that is happened, and the contraction potential of the muscle, the force generating contraction potential of the muscle that is creating that joint motion, which just isn't true. It's a systemic expression. It's everything all at once. If you don't like it, we can change it. We don't have to narratize it, but we can change the expression quite comfortably and quickly if we understand the process of coaching. And this is where the next one of the next videos comes in, which is motor control. And I think if people just understood what motor control was, I think a lot of the conversations and questions and queries around all of these ideas would just fall by the wayside, because ultimately motor control is just coordinated movement of a system that has a central nervous system. That's what humans are. We have a central nervous system. That central nervous system has inputs coming into the system, and the process of movement on the other side is a reactive approach to that information that comes in. It's never proactive, ever. The system brings information in, It is processed at the level of the central nervous system, whether that be at the spinal cord, whether that be at the brain. That information comes in incredibly quickly, and significantly more information that we could ever hold and understand at a conscious level. Majority of it is happening subconscious. All of that information comes in, it's processed, and we see an expression. We see a motor output on the other side. And we as coaches think that we could do a better job than what the human system has evolved to be able to do through its motor control and motor learning processes. In reality, though, that subconscious swirl of information almost always is going to take over, especially as high amounts of fatigue and high amounts of force are starting to be produced. We can learn and teach clients different ways to move, but if the system thinks that there is going to be a more efficient strategy to achieve the task, and I'm not saying with the presentation of pain, I'm not saying with the presentation of injuries and all of those sort of things, but if you're lifting a heavy fucking load and you are creating this conscious override of the system, maybe you're trying to get your client to force their knees out, maybe you're trying to get the client to tuck their elbows in the bench press, and when things get hard, when things get heavy, everything always reverts back to the thing you're trying to move away from. I think that is telling us something about how the system itself wants to move and what the system thinks is going to be the most efficient strategy. And yes, it doesn't mean that we self-organize everything and we just let clients go. Absolutely not, because there's different strategies that we can do to load different areas of the body and take tension away and shift and manage tension, absolutely. But the process of learning new skills is motor control and motor learning, which is inherently understood from decades of research, and there's plenty of ways to structure training and structure practice and exposures and all of those sort of things that allow us to pretty accurate ways in order to teach people to move in what we deem to be more efficient manners. That's fantastic, and lean into that stuff. What I am saying with motor control and motor learning, though, is that the system is heavily going to be a subconscious, information-driven, reactive process of expression. That's the first thing. So getting a better understanding of where the information is coming from is really important, and how we can manage some of those informations and those sensory inputs and provide context around them so the client actually understands what's going on is really important. And this fits within my sensory motor continuum. But also what's really important is understanding that the expression that we observe is a systemic expression. And again, we're back to shitting on stability. If we see something happening, there's a very, very high likelihood that it's not the response of an individual joint or an individual muscle that's creating that. More than likely, it is a systemic strategy that is being expressed. And within training, more often than not, it just comes down to how we're managing the gravity influence on the system. If we can change that, we can very quickly change the expression, and it's not hard at all. So that's the motor control part of it, because I don't think enough coaches understand motor control. This is a big rant. I'm gone for 30 minutes here. I don't even know if I'm making sense anymore. But the final two videos is center of mass, which I've been hammering. And I'm actually starting to see more and more center of mass propaganda out there in the world, which is awesome. I think it's the governing movement principle. And if you can understand center of mass and center of gravity and the reaction process of managing center of gravity within the base of support, I think you're going to be a significantly better coach, especially for all of the things that most clients are coming to you for, which is improving strength and output in the gym, improving hypertrophy as an outcome, improving movement quality, confidence in the gym, and also like managing and shifting tension and tightness around the structure and the system. All stems from where are we and how are we managing gravity more than anything else. So if you can understand how gravity influences the center of mass, which becomes the center of gravity, I just think about it as a center of mass. But if you can understand that, you can very quickly understand how the system is actually coordinating to produce what we're seeing and observing as the movement outcome or the motor outcome, the motor output, if we tie it back to motor control. And then finally, we have relative motion and how to actually load muscles. This doesn't go into all of the coupled actions of things like dorsiflexion, riding with tibial IR, which also rides with a pronation of the subtalar joint. We're not talking about any of those sort of things, or the talocrural joint. We're not talking about any of those like coupled actions when we discuss this in the free course. What we're actually just discussing is that there's two standard movement strategies that are available to the system. The first one to understand is relative motion, and that is two bones and how they relatively are moving and speaking to each other through motion. And this can be driven via, if we take like the hip, the pelvis can move around the femur, or the femur can move within the pelvis. And depending on the speed and the direction of those movements will change the relative motion of that joint. So even though we might be moving into an external rotation from the distal, so the leg is feeding ER up the chain, if the pelvis is rotating around the femur faster into internal rotation, we are going to see an internal rotation of that hip. This is commonly what we're going to see when we think of something like a golf swing and a lateralization of center of mass. There's going to be an ER driver up the chain. However, the pelvis and the mass is probably going to be moving faster than the femur, which means we're actually closing the anterior joint space. And this is how we then load something like a glute max or a glute med in the frontal plane. We create an IR'd hip position via a lateralization of the center of mass. And that's the understanding of relative motion. So it's the direction and the speed that the bones are moving creates relative changes of that joint, or of the tissues that surround the joint. And it's really important to understand because that's how we actually load muscles. In order to load a muscle, we have to get the actual external load right. So where the weight is, or the direction of our center of mass, and all of those sort of things. But if we can move weight in the right direction and create the relative motion of the joint itself, we can actually start to learn to load and unload tissues within the structure. A lot of it comes back to our center of gravity and center of mass idea of where we're positioned in space and the management strategy there. But if we can create relative motion of joints and create this sort of opening and closing of joint spaces, it means that we can change the length of the tissues and structures that surround those joints, which then means we can manage the tension response better. And the tension response is what actually drives the outcomes that we're looking for. And if you go back to tension of the video, you can see how that all plays out because it's reactive to everything else. So we have to get all of the inputs right so that the reactive tensile strategy is what we actually want to see and the movement that we want to express. So relative motion is one of the available strategies, which is actual joint motion. The other one is called orientational motion. And orientational motion normally is just motion that's expressed above or below the joint. And the joint moves in space, but there's no relative change at the joint. So for the hip, we may actually see a big orientational shift from the proximal structures of the rib cage and the lumbar spine, which shift the pelvis in space and take the leg with it. Quite often, this is what we're going to see with a center of mass that drives forward and starts to extend the system. We're going to see a pelvis that rolls forward into an anterior tilt, which could be seen as hip flexion, which would close internal rotation space at the hip. However, it's not true internal rotation of the hip. It's a relative internal rotation because we've closed the space. However, it came from an orientational shift above and the system moved, which closed the joint space. It doesn't mean that we actually changed the loading of the muscles around the hip. It's just that the space has changed. The direction, the speed and the direction of the bones have changed, but some of those muscles might not have actually had any tension present because the tension was held elsewhere in the system. Now we're back to tensegrity-based models, and now we're back to shitting on stability because a lot of the ideas that I think are narratives in the system can, with these 7 videos, granted, they're 20 minutes only. They're not everything. It's too big. The movement mentorship is 90 minutes by 2 by 12, by 6. There's 12 calls of 90 minutes. What does that equal? 18 hours of just content in the movement mentorship. Not including the pre-learning modules, which is 3, that's 21 hours. And then not including all of the discussion board and the discussion questions and the DMs and the chats that I'm having. But in the movement mentorship, which, going back to the model understanding, is my model of how I view and understand this stuff, and what has been productive for me in my career is what I'm trying to help you with, and remove a lot of these narratives and get you to better understand some of the global concepts of human movement. That is like 25 hours. Let's just call it a 25-hour mentorship across 8 weeks, because you get the pre-learning 2 weeks prior. So you're not going to be able to go through this free course and completely understand everything that I'm on about and all of these arguments and discussions online. It's just not going to happen through the free course. However, if you've got a brain and you can objectively take in some information and think about what is going on with these conversations, I can honestly say that this free course has the potential to reshape your understanding of the coaching process through the understanding of load, some of those models, and the subjective world that we're living in, and also the movement expression that we're observing and witnessing. Because as coaches, we teach movement. That is what we do. That is our job. Objectively, that is our job. We get people in the gym and we teach them how to move. So if you don't understand some of the deeper things around movement and the ideas and the principles around a more zoomed out approach of things like tensegrity-based models, things like center of mass and gravity and the reactive tension response and all of these sort of things, you're going to struggle when you come up against decisions that need to be made with better prescribing movement. And ultimately, the free course is there to get you on your way to thinking about this stuff just a little bit differently. If you ever have questions, you can message me or tune back in, or hopefully jump in the wormhole or the movement mentorship, depending on the type of education that you're looking for. But I've set this free course up so that if you're following along and you have questions around some of the ideas that I have, there's a good chance, there's probably like a 90% chance that it is at least touched on via the free course. So you can do some learning, and if you need more resources or whatever, you can ask questions, you can drop them in the course. I think it's just going to be awesome, and I think we've had like 140 people take it in the last 2 days, which is great. Whether or not they've actually gone through it, I would assume that people would just go and watch 1 or 2 of the videos, but hopefully they watch all of them. And if you do decide to jump in, please let me know how it is, and then if you have any questions, because these are the things that I think are most important related to our jobs as coaches. So please check it out. Again, the free course is linked down below, so you can jump on it there. Probably the only other thing to say is that on November 4th, so a couple of weeks away, the wormhole formally opens, but also the Intake 3 registrations start. Intake 3 is going to kick off on the 13th of January. That's when the pre-learning comes in. And I think the first call is on the 30th of Jan, which will be unreal. I'm already thinking about changing some of the pre-learning modules just a little bit, just based off some of the questions and queries that we've had throughout the first intakes, with over 100 coaches through there, which has been great. But if you're interested in learning more about my models and all of those sort of things, and taking them deeper, the wormhole and Intake 3 will open for the start of November, so November 4th. So please keep an eye out on that. And please jump in the free course. Can't recommend it enough. I'll see you next week.